Okay, I'm recording. I'm in North Carolina right now, and so I'm just recording this video, not as a group Zoom, but just by myself here. And I'm going to upload it to the content uh, as soon as it uploads to the YouTube. So this is the second part of the chapter 17 um, lecture, and it's about the the first part was about the early Renaissance, and this is going to be about the high Renaissance. So mainly Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci. So now I'm going to share my screen and go to my PowerPoint. Okay. So we're just, we're only, in this course, we're only talking about the Italian Renaissance. There's another whole other Renaissance that's really interesting, the Northern Renaissance that was going on at the same time. And there's some stuff about that in the e-learn content of your course if you want to check that out. It's if you scroll to the bottom of the content, you can find stuff about the Northern Renaissance. But we're focusing on the Italian Renaissance just in the interest of time because we can't talk about every art thing in the world. This is just an intro, not a comprehensive survey. Okay, so the slides, the images that you see up here are from uh, the High Renaissance, which begins uh, around 1500, again in Florence, and mainly, but also in Rome, Italy. So let's just sort of look at this image on your left, and you see it's the classic thing, right? It's a Madonna, that is the Virgin Mary, a very young Madonna. She looks like she could be 16 years old, and Jesus and some little toddler angels. And the toddler angels are kind of lifting Jesus up for Mary to hold because he's crabby. You can see he looks kind of fussy. And it's almost like they're saying, you know, he's not happy playing with us. He wants you. And they're giving him back to his mom. And you know, this is a very different baby Jesus from the ones that um, we've seen before. He's looks much more like a real baby. His head is big like a real baby. And he doesn't look like a little man. He looks like a he looks like a sure enough baby. And he also he looks a little annoyed. So at this point in the Renaissance, there's kind of a problem. And that is that Renaissance artists wanted to portray holy figures, people in the Bible, saints, Mary, Jesus, and so on. But they wanted them to look human, not as they did in the Middle Ages, where they were these sort of elongated, abstract bodies. But it's almost as if in the High Renaissance, the figures became so human looking that they were a little bit too human. They didn't seem divine anymore. You can see that Mary has a little trace of a halo. So the big flat gold plates that angels had behind their heads in the early Renaissance and late medieval period are gone. And now this artist, it's I don't know who the artist is. It's not really important. Has drawn just a very, almost like this wire that is floating in the air behind Mary's head that's supposed to indicate her divinity. And actually, Jesus doesn't have one at all. He's a very human looking baby, and she's a human looking mother, although a very beautiful girl. Um, and so, how do you know that they're even divine? Well, this angel has wings, but he's looking back at you with this kind of um, laughing expression on his face, like, can you believe this baby? He's gotten so crabby he won't even play with us anymore. And I don't know who this is back here, another angel maybe. So it's getting a little too realistic. Let's put it that way. Um, so how 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 did how did artists of the High Renaissance solve this problem? Well, if you look at the painting on the right, you can see uh, something about this. Okay, this angel here was painted by Leonardo da Vinci when he was apprenticed to an artist called Verrocchio. So this is when Leonardo was still fairly young, maybe in his teens or 20s, and he was learning to be an artist. And so he had an apprenticeship with Verrocchio. So Verrocchio painted this angel who looks just like a boy. And then Leonardo painted this angel. And this is part of a much larger painting. This is just a detail from the painting. And you can see that Leonardo has kind of solved the problem of making naturalistic figures that look human but are still divine. This angel is so ideally beautiful that he or she appears to be completely divine, despite the fact that this angel also looks human. There's no wings. The halo is there, but it's kind of a vestigial halo, you could say. And the angel is holding a robe. This is a painting about the baptism of Jesus by John the Baptist. And so, he had to take off his clothes to get water poured over his head. So this angel is holding Jesus's clothes while Jesus is being baptized. So this ideally beautiful angel in a somewhat complex pose. So you can see that the angel's body is twisted to his or her left, but her head is twisted to the right. So this kind of twisted but elegant pose is characteristic of the High Renaissance, of the work of Leonardo and Michelangelo. First, we're going to look at Leonardo. Okay, so Leonardo, um, so the dates of the High Renaissance are about 1490 to 1530. So about a 50-year period beginning early in the 1500s. And during this period, artists became intellectuals for the first time, professionals. They were not just artisans anymore. They were Renaissance men. And Leonardo is probably the most Renaissance-y of any Renaissance man. He could sort of do everything. He could draw, he was an engineer, he was an architect, he was a painter, he was a scientist, he was an anatomist. He was just gifted in many different areas. Now, a lot of people have heard of that book called The Da Vinci Code. So I just want to point out that Da Vinci was not really his last name. He didn't have a last name. He was illegitimate. And he was just Leonardo da Vinci, meaning from the town of Vinci. It would be like I would be Shannon from All Good. So when art historians refer to him as Leonardo, not as Da Vinci, which really doesn't mean anything. Okay, so one of the things that Leonardo did that had really kind of never been done before was he made a lot of very detailed anatomical drawings in ink in a kind of journal that he kept. And he made an extensive study of human anatomy, and he pretty much got most of it right. So here you can see let's just be honest, to get this knowledge, he dissected cadavers, which was illegal, but he managed to obtain the bodies of criminals or people who had died and were not being formally buried or something, and he could dissect them. Now, you can see this is an image of a a baby inside the uterus, and I'm not saying that he dissected a pregnant woman who had died or something, because actually he got the shape of the uterus wrong. He thought it was almost perfectly spherical, and it's not. It's oblong in order to fit the baby better, actually. but he did, and this the other thing is, this baby, if he's about to be born, he's in trouble because he's presenting breech with a breech position, which means butt first. You're supposed to come out head first. But other than that, his drawing of the sort of curled position of a fetus or a baby in the uterus is correct. So he mostly got things correct. He was a superb draftsman in every medium: pen and ink, chalk, graphite, silver point, everything he tried. He was one of the greatest draftsmen who's ever lived. Okay, so here's a double spread, you could say, of his from his journal, showing his understanding of the skeleton, which is pretty much accurate, which is amazing considering this was 500 years ago, before there was any sort of um, formal study of medicine or of anatomy. He pretty much took it on himself to figure it out. And if you've ever taken um, anatomy in college, you may have had a textbook where there were drawings like this. Sometimes drawings explain anatomy better, really, than a photograph could. And here you can see that he's figured out all the tendons and ligaments of the shoulder joint perfectly, and how they fuse, with how they sort of transition into the tendons and ligaments of the neck. And even he did a drawing of the face. So if you're interested in all this, you can, there's a video in the content from the Khan Academy site that goes through a lot of his drawings, which luckily have been preserved in folios, um, and a lot of them are in a special museum in England. So we can, it's wonderful that we can see these drawings. Now the writing is unusual. It's obviously it's in Italian, but it's called mirror writing. So Leonardo was left-handed, and he wrote from right to left in what he called mirror writing. So to read it in Italian, you have to use a mirror to look at it. I don't really know why he wrote that way. Maybe it was just easier for him because he was left-handed. All right, so in this, the purpose of this slide is sort of demonstrate how far Leonardo had advanced beyond the medieval understanding of anatomy of the human body. So I think I showed you this painting before, when in the previous lecture. It shows you medieval painting of Adam and Eve, Eve on this side, Adam on this side, and the very unrealistic, ignorant of anatomy way that the artist tried to connect the nude shoulders of a man to his body, and this really terrible attempt to draw a woman's upper body, nude upper body. He just couldn't do it. And maybe he didn't really care because in the Middle Ages, the human body was not really, it wasn't considered important, right? It was just a vessel for the spirit, and the spirit was what was important, and what lasted after death and the afterlife and all of that, as we discussed in the last lecture. But in the Renaissance, that all changed, and suddenly the human body, even the nude human body, and the present life, that is this life, not just the hereafter, became important because of humanism, as we discussed last time. So, Leonardo understands perfectly how the shoulder attaches to the upper chest. He's figured that out. So, how did he use this understanding of anatomy? Well, he used it in very sophisticated and innovative ways. So, this is a drawing, a so-called cartoon, that is a full-scale drawing for a painting. Um, but the drawing really, I think, is better than the painting. I'll show you the painting in a minute, but I like the drawing kind of better, really. Um, and I saw it in real life somewhere. Um, think in London. It's in a museum in London. Anyway, what it's called, the Virgin Child and Saint Anne. Okay, so this is the Virgin Mary, again, the classic subject in the Renaissance, early Renaissance, late Renaissance, Middle Ages, just pretty much for hundreds of years, holding the baby Jesus. Here he is, making a little papal blessing sort of gesture, and St. John the Baptist as a child. Obviously, he's not grown up yet. He can't baptize Jesus yet. And St. Anne. Okay, so this is St. Anne is the Virgin Mary's mother. So it's a sort of family portrait here. So, what is it about this uh, drawing that's unique and special? Well, one thing, and I put some Italian words right here, is the chiaroscuro, which we've already talked about, which means the modeling of a three-dimensional figure using light and dark um, gradations. So, there's a highlight on their knees, there's a highlight on her forehead and on her cheeks, and so you can see that her head, you can see the three-dimensionality of her head. Same over here with Saint Anne. And this beautiful modeling is one of the things that Leonardo could do so well. But then there's an additional characteristic of his painting and drawing that is called sfumato, and that just means smokiness. So around the eyes of his figures, there's a kind of smokiness. That's really the only way to describe it. It's almost like they put eyeshadow on or something. And when we look at the Mona Lisa, you'll see that there's a kind of softness in the faces of Leonardo's figures that make them instantly recognizable as Leonardo's. But also there's these very complex poses. So if you can spend a lot of time sort of analyzing this drawing in terms of the complex intertwinement of the figures. So you have Mary here, and her lower body is sort of turned away. It's almost like she's sitting on the lap of her mother, but not quite. And here's the uh, St. Anne's knees. So she's turned to her own right, but then her upper body is turned back to her own left, and then her head is kind of tilted. And then there's a sort of directional forces here. St. Anne looking at Mary, who's looking at Jesus, who's looking at John, who looks back at Jesus. And then there's a kind of movement here through the arm, her arm, and then the baby's arm, and then over to the head of this child. And then this interesting up and down movement of the knees is really complicated. So it's a complicated sort of twisted pose. It almost reminds you of the Hellenistic phase of Greek sculpture, like the Laocoon or something. And indeed, the Laocoon was unearthed in the early 1500s and had a huge influence on Michelangelo, if not Leonardo. So this is the gesture drawing um, for that larger drawing. Gesture drawings are just drawings that artists do for their own. It's like a study to figure out. You don't erase really very much. You just keep the pencil or chalk going, and you just keep kind of making these kind of scribbly drawings that are very useful for getting this kind of movement, deciding on how you want to represent the figures movement wise. So this is the painting that was eventually created of that subject, but again, I just don't think it's nearly as interesting as the drawing. He's removed John the Baptist completely, and you just have St. Anne with Mary literally on her lap, reaching for the baby Jesus, who in turn is reaching for a lamb. So there's all sorts of iconographical meaning here about the sacrificial lamb and all of that. But the other drawing, I think, is much more complex and characteristic of of Leonardo, but you can see the sfumato around the faces, the sort of smoky um, fan brush. That's what I think he did it with. Activity that sort of smooths out the lines of the eyes in particular, but also around the mouth. So just to contrast with Leonardo's sophisticated modeling here using chiaroscuro and sfumato, here's a painting from the same period, um, that's not much more flat. You can see, and again, the name of the artist is not important. I didn't even write it down, I don't think. But it's just it's a painting from the same period of time and from Italy, but there's almost no modeling. The figures are just very flat, almost like cutouts. Whereas, and this is again a baptism scene. Um, Whereas Leonardo's figures are rounded in space. You know, they have real mass. Okay, now this painting by Leonardo is one of his most famous paintings, but unfortunately, it's in terrible condition, and it's a very complicated painting in some ways. There's a lot to say about it, in other words, and so I urge you to look at the video in the content about it. But we'll just go over some of the main things about it. So it's a picture of the Last Supper, the night before Jesus died, and he's telling his disciples, of whom there are 12, as you probably know, one of you will betray me. And so when he says that, they all kind of go crazy and they're like, oh no, who is it? So you have four groups of three. Here's three of his disciples here, another three here, another three here, and another three here. Now, if you know a lot about Bible stories, you may know that Judas right here is the one who betrayed Jesus. The Romans gave him some money, 50 pieces of silver or something like that, which he's holding actually in his hand in this picture in a little bag in exchange for Judas telling them where he was or something so they could arrest him. He was a snitch or a narc, you could say. Anyway, he's right here. Jesus is in the center here, gesturing to bread and reaching for, I think this is a glass of wine. So this is also the establishment of the Eucharist. That is, this is my body, this is my blood. Whenever you eat bread and wine together, it's, you're doing this in remembrance of me or something like that. So it's both those moments. It's both the moment of saying, hey, one of you is a snitch, and saying, okay, this is what you should do to remember me. Take some bread and drink some wine. So, but let's just look at the room here that this is set in. First of all, it's a pretty plain room. There's not a lot of decoration. Normally, in a picture of the Last Supper, there would be a very ornate looking room, but this is a fairly simple room. And if you remember what we've learned about linear perspective, of course, Leonardo is using that. That technique has been around for 100 years. And the orthogonals all converge to right about here. The overhead orthogonals, the tops of the doors, the edges of the table. And you can see that in this diagram here. Okay, so again, Leonardo is a Renaissance man. He's a humanist. He wants to represent holy figures as humans, not supernatural figures. And so he no longer uses halos because nobody's ever seen a halo in real life. But he still wants to indicate the divinity of Jesus, especially. So he uses the architecture, actually, to create a there's an arch behind Jesus' head and a sky with light, sort of a sunset, an evening sky. And that light behind Jesus' head sort of functions as a halo in effect. So And again, this painting is in terrible condition because Leonardo tried to do something different from the usual fresco method of applying pigment to wet plaster. He tried to put a ground on first, and it just didn't work. The After a few years, the paint was flaking off. So we don't really know what this looked like when he first painted it. It's been retouched and restored several times. And so, we can't really see it as Leonardo intended it. But if you watch the video about this, the video zooms in on some of the faces and the hands in a really beautiful way. So I urge you to watch that and look at the figures. Okay, so this is a more conventional Last Supper from another Italian artist. As you can see, it's a very ornate room with fancy marble. The other thing that's different about it is that um, he's put Judas on. This is Jesus here. And Thomas falling asleep, evidently. But Judas is on the opposite side of the table from the other apostles to make sure you don't miss him. It's not nearly as subtle as Leonardo's painting, where he's just one of the guys. He's not like a special evil guy on the other side of the table in a chair, almost like a high chair that's too big for him. So, yeah, this is so Leonardo did a lot of new things here. He humanized Judas. He didn't make him look extra bad, and he situated the whole thing in a very simple room. And again, the figures interact in complex ways, which is one of Leonardo's sort of trademarks. Whereas here, not so much. They're just sitting next to each other. Okay, here's a detail from the painting where you can even kind of see who some of the people are. Thomas, sometimes known as Doubting Thomas, um, the disciple John, Peter, who became the first pope, and Judas clutching his little bag of silver. Now his hand is reaching towards, here's the glass of wine here. I think in the Bible, Jesus says something like, there's somebody at the table here who is sharing a plate with me, and that person will betray me. So there's a little plate, presumably with some olive oil in it, that they're dipping the bread into, and Judas is reaching for that plate at the same time that Jesus is. So, okay. So one thing that some art historians have pointed out is that Jesus's figure forms this sort of stable triangle. There's a lot of movement in this painting, um, directional forces, gestures that create these sort of curving lines, but in the center of it all, there's this stable triangle created by the figure of Jesus. Okay, so another very famous painting by Leonardo, which you probably heard of, is the Mona Lisa. And this is where you can really see the sfumato, the almost like I was saying, like eyeshadow or something around the eyes and at the corners of the mouth of his figures, these very softened kind of features. And that's partly what gives this painting its kind of enigmatic quality. That is, um, the feeling of mystery that has always surrounded this painting. Well, you can't quite tell if she's happy or sad. Like her mouth is kind of curled up a little, but her eyes are not really smiling, and it's just hard to decipher this expression here. But actually, the reason this painting is famous, besides the fact that Leonardo painted it and it survived, is that it was stolen from the Louvre in 1911. It was returned in 1914 to the Louvre Museum in Paris, France. It ended up in France because Leonardo ended up in France. At the end of his life, he ended up working for a French king, And he kept this painting with him his whole life. He made it in 1503, but he still had it with him when he died in France. And no one really knows why. He painted it presumably on commission as a portrait for some middle class family. So in the 1500s, only a few people really had portraits made of themselves. There were no photographs, and portraits took a long time to make. And so wealthy people, merchants in Florence or wherever, would commission an artist or a painter to make a painting of, somebody in their family. So we don't really know who this person was or why Leonardo didn't end up delivering the portrait to the people who commissioned it. So let's just look at some other portraits from this era to sort of see how this one is different. So this is the typical Italian portrait from that time. It was usually in profile, and the hands were usually not in the portrait. By contrast, Leonardo, the Mona Lisa, we see her in 3/4 view rather than profile. She's not strictly frontal. This is called 3/4 view. And we do see her hands. Her hands are beautiful and very expressive and an important part of the portrait. But that was unusual in the Italian Renaissance. Now, Leonardo did know that in Northern Europe, in the Northern Renaissance, there were portraits, and this one's by Dürer, that were in 3/4 view, and the hands were in the portrait, usually clasped in prayer. I mean, that's not what's going on in the Mona Lisa. Her hands are just kind of folded. This landscape behind her has always been a mystery. It's not really a naturalistic landscape. It looks like it looks like another planet almost, like some sort of science fiction landscape. There's a road that sort of winds into the distance, but then it just becomes this kind of hazy mountains in the distance or something that look like, again, like some sort of sci-fi landscape. There were, I mean, Italian portraits did sometimes have a landscape in the background, but usually it was more representational. So another thing. Okay, now this is the Mona Lisa here. This is a copy of the Mona Lisa that was allegedly painted at the exact same time. So this was found hundreds of years later, and it's thought that whoever painted this copy was copying Leonardo while he was painting this one. That is, there was another artist there who was copying stroke by stroke what Leonardo did. I mean, there's no mistaking the Leonardo. It's the face and the head are much more Leonardo-like. This is slightly more idealized, I feel like, and the head's a little too long almost. Something's not quite right about this one. But the varnish on this one has not yellowed to the same degree that the varnish has yellowed on the Mona Lisa. So by looking at this contemporaneous copy, we can see what the colors might have been like originally on the real Mona Lisa. But since the varnish has become yellowed, as varnish sometimes does, we can't see the Mona Lisa as Leonardo saw it. So let's just go back to the other slide. See, it's very yellow. So when you go to see it in Paris, and as I said, it's in the Louvre, it's in a room all by itself. It's not huge, and there's like hundreds of people in there taking a picture of it, again, because it's this super famous painting. And its fame mainly derives from the fact that it was stolen and then recovered. It's become sort of a symbol of France in a way. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the other Ninja Turtle, or one of the other Ninja Turtles, um, Michelangelo. Uh, As you may remember from your childhood, the Ninja Turtles were Donatello, Michelangelo, Leonardo, and Raphael. Okay, we've talked about Donatello in the last lecture, and in this one we're talking about Leonardo and Michelangelo, but we're not really going to talk about Raphael. You can investigate Raphael on your own if you're interested in that particular Ninja Turtle. Okay, so Michelangelo was a contemporary of Leonardo, um, also from the area of Florence, and but he was primarily a sculptor. And when he was very young, he got this commission to make a sculpture, a monumental, that is, a very large sculpture of David. So in the last lecture, I talked about David, the biblical story of David who slew the Philistine giant Goliath, and the fact that David was a symbol for the Florentine Republic because they saw themselves as sort of these underdogs vis-a-vis the more militarized states of Italy, like the Papal States and Milan, and that had huge armies and monarchies. They were a republic as opposed to a monarchy. That is, they were governed by citizens, not by a king. Although, of course, the citizen you were only a citizen if you were a man and a resident of Florence. So women were not couldn't vote. They didn't actually have slaves like the Romans, but um, you know, only aristocratic men were really, or middle class and aristocratic men were part of this republic. So it's not the kind of democracy that we would think of as democracy, but still, compared to the kingdoms of Milan or the Papal States, it was pretty much a more of a democracy. That is, not a monarchy, a republic. And David was the symbol for this republic because he was a young boy who defeated this terrifying giant all by himself. So this statue is, like I said, it's like 19 feet tall or something. And Michelangelo carved it out of marble when he was very young. He was in his 20s and he was already pretty famous. And the city government of Florence commissioned him to make this portrait of David. It's very different from Donatello's David. Donatello's David has already killed Goliath and is standing on his head. This is David when he first sees Goliath, and he's got his stone in his huge right hand and his slingshot, which is not like a stick, but a leather sling in his left hand on his shoulder, and he's sort of sizing up Goliath and getting ready to throw this rock at him. So again, because this is sculpture, you kind of need to see it in the round. That is, you need to see all sides of it to really understand it. And for that reason, you really should watch the video in the Khan Academy site and watch that's linked to in the content, and which zooms in on his face, which is very expressive, and gives you more of a sense of what it would be like to see this sculpture. And I did see this sculpture when I was 18, and it made a huge impression on me. It's in Rome now. No, wait, wrong. It's in Florence. I'm pretty sure. Anyway, it's in Italy somewhere. And there's, again, like the Mona Lisa, there's always a lot of people, a lot of tourists coming to see it, because it's amazing. Now, when you look at this, I'm sure you'll be reminded of Greek sculpture and to some extent Roman copies of Greek sculpture. So, this is classicizing. That is, this is Italy. The Romans adopted most of the ideas of Greek sculpture, and so Michelangelo has seen the Roman sculpture and Greek sculpture that had been imported from Greece in Italy, and he's um, working in that tradition. So that's why it's called classicizing. That is, it refers to ancient Greeks and ancient Romans in its style. And you can see that David is standing in that contrapposto stance where the weight is on his right leg and his left leg is loose. So that means this hip joint is highly sort of elevated above this hip, but this shoulder has dropped and this shoulder is raised. So it's classical contrapposto, maybe a little easier to see even than in, say, the Critios boy from the ancient Greeks. And then, and his head is turned even more so than, um, say, in the Critios boy. There's a certain amount of, I mean, he's also seen Donatello's David. So he's thinking about that. And this David is completely nude. He doesn't have those little shoes and boots on that Donatello's David had. And he's not wearing a hat. He's got a big head of hair here, but no flowery hat. And you can also see that Michelangelo has completely mastered male anatomy. He gets it. He studied it. He understands it. And the thing that really blows me away about this sculpture is he understands the body in motion, or even in right before some sort of action. Like you can see this little muscle here. I don't know what it's called, but it's jumping up a little bit because David's right hand is tensing up. He's holding the rock. His hand is flexed, and as a result, this muscle in his upper arm is flexed, and you can see it. And that's the kind of thing you really need to look at the video to get to really see. But it's just that level of understanding of anatomy that makes this so mind-boggling. And the Florentines loved it. They it was originally going to go on a tall building way up above this public square in Florence, but it was so beautiful that they decided to keep it at ground level where people could see it better. And so it was originally outside in a kind of piazza or square. But now because, we don't want environmental damage to happen to it, like acid rain or whatever, there's a replica there now, and the real thing is inside. So this is just here kind of as a joke. I saw this in the New York Times in an article about Brad Pitt. Somebody put Brad Pitt's body on this Michelangelo's David's body, and they put a big fig leaf there. So it's just kind of funny. Okay, so what else did Michelangelo do? He was primarily a sculptor, but at one point in his life, the Pope summoned him to Rome from Florence and said, okay, Michelangelo, you're going to do a series of paintings for me, fresco paintings, in the Sistine Chapel in Rome. So the Sistine Chapel is an important room where when the Pope dies, the cardinals meet in the Sistine Chapel down here, and they have to decide who the next pope is going to be. And sometimes it takes days for them to make that decision. So this is where they decide that. I guess they vote on it or something. I don't really know. So in there's some paintings on the walls, but then Michelangelo was responsible for the painting of the ceiling. And what he decided to do was a series of paintings about the book of Genesis, really, showing the creation of the world, the creation of Adam and Eve being expelled from the Garden of Eden. And then on the sides are portraits of prophets and sibyls. So as I explained before, prophets are mostly old men from who wrote the Old Testament books that prophesied the coming of Jesus. And sibyls are mostly women from pagan times, that is, pre-Christian times, who in some way also foretold the coming of Jesus. So we'll see some examples of that in a minute. So you've already seen this painting. We talked about fresco. So the Sistine Chapel is a fresco painting, and what it's famous for is this amazing modeling, chiaroscuro, the Italian word for dark to light, and for color. So, not to mention just the command that Michelangelo had of human anatomy, mainly male anatomy. But it wasn't really known until recently what a great colorist Michelangelo was, because, again, like the Mona Lisa, the Sistine Chapel was sort of covered in a dirty film of smoke from the candles in the Sistine Chapel over hundreds of years. And so when I saw it in 1972, you couldn't really see the colors. It wasn't that it looked like it was in black and white, but it wasn't very colorful as I recall. But now it is, because the whole thing has been cleaned. The smoke and the soot has been cleaned off. And when it was cleaned off, it was discovered that the fresco colors were as clear and beautiful and bright as they had been in 1512 when Michelangelo finished this painting. So, yeah, these amazing greens, these pinks, these reds, it's just incredible. Okay, so again, let's just remember what this is supposed to be. This is the creation of Adam. So here's Adam in this kind of impossible pose. If you try this pose at home, it's like some kind of awful yoga pose. It's not at all comfortable, but Michelangelo, because of his knowledge of anatomy and his understanding of how to draw the human body, could make it look natural and kind of unforced. So here's Adam over here, and God is transmitting the spark of life to Adam through his finger, or about to do so. Now, this is not in the Bible. There's nothing in the Bible that said God flew to to the Garden of Eden in a big cloak and touched Adam's finger and Adam came to life. It doesn't say that. There's two or three different accounts in the book of Genesis about the creation of Adam, that he was made from dirt or something like that. But this is something that Michelangelo imagined. This is his version of God bringing Adam to life. And his imagining of God as a kind of senior citizen man, that's also Michelangelo's idea. So, our idea, maybe the ever since, of what God looks like is kind of based on Michelangelo's idea, really. That God has this flowing beard and long white hair, and that he's a very buff guy in his 60s or early 70s. That all comes from Michelangelo, pretty much. Now, who are all these other people? Well, that's kind of a mystery. Uh, so you can see that this lady here who's looking towards Adam, most art historians think that's supposed to be Eve. I think for a while they thought it was the Virgin Mary, but then they realized no one has ever represented the Virgin Mary in the nude, so it's probably not the Virgin Mary. And she's looking directly at Adam, like checking him out, kind of. So people think this is Eve. Now, God's hand is also sort of pointing at this fat baby here, and some people have said that that's Jesus. Maybe. But who are are these just random, very muscular baby angels? Who knows? And how does this work exactly? I mean, the whole thing is not, in a way, it's not realistic. This is not a realistic landscape, right? There's no atmospheric perspective, or much less linear perspective. The anatomy is pretty real, although somewhat idealized, you could say. But this is all fiction. It's a sort of, it's an expression of spirituality. And that was the goal of Michelangelo's, one of his goals was that his figures would be spiritually expressive on their own, not just for the role that they're playing in a Bible story. In other words, even if you didn't know, if you just saw this part of the painting by itself and you didn't know that it was part of this larger painting, and you would still see this figure as divinely beautiful and having a certain expressiveness of its own aside from the story that it's part of. And there's a lot of emotion in these paintings. I feel like it's not, there's these, again, these complex poses, this sort of crossed leg here that God has, this twisted pose where he's looking to his own right, but there's a lot going on to his left here too. And this incredible twisting of Adam's figure, you know, so that Michelangelo really shows the torso from the front, but then Adam is, his right arm is twisted behind him to his right, but he's looking to his left. It's all very complicated. And the hands are just, I mean, I could spend forever just looking at these hands. It's so hard to draw a hand. It's hard to draw a hand accurately and to draw a hand that looks this expressive and beautiful. And this one too, although this one's a little scary, maybe, um, is incredibly, that's just incredible drawing. Michelangelo also was a famous draftsman. All right, so we've looked at this before. This is the preliminary study for that painting, where you can see Michelangelo kind of working out the modeling, how he's going to model the three-dimensional mass of the body and working out the hand gestures here. This is one of the very few drawings that have survived from the Sistine Chapel drawings. And here's another one. Okay, so this is from the spandrels, that is the edges of the ceiling. And if you watch the video in the content about the Sistine Chapel, you'll see how these spandrel paintings fit into the overall design of the Sistine Chapel. But what this shows is a figure called the Libyan Sibyl. So the Sibyls are female figures. They're not Christian or even Jewish Old Testament figures. They're, pagan figures that somehow writers or prophets, in this case from Libya, who foretold somehow the coming of Jesus. So the Libyan Sibyl here is, again, in one of these very complex, twisted poses where she's sort of pushing off with her right and left toes almost, and she's turned to get a book that has this prophecy in it of the coming of Jesus. But she's looking down, and she has this incredible hairdo with braids and bandanas and this dress. Oh my God, this strapless dress that's just, I love the color. I love everything about this dress. I think it would be hard to pull off. It wouldn't be easy to wear. But it's amazing. All right, and because of this strapless dress, you can see the musculature of her upper body, which, Michelangelo was all about that. Now, Michelangelo was gay, and he didn't draw female figures with the same care that he drew male figures. He kind of would do a study from a male figure, and this is a model that Michelangelo, somebody he hired to model for him for the study, and it's a boy, a guy who worked in his studio probably for him. And he softened the musculature a little bit because this is supposed to be a lady, but you can see that he didn't. Here he's trying to figure out where her breast would go, and he couldn't really figure it out. Let's be honest, he wasn't that interested in women at all, let's just say. And so sometimes his female figures have, they they look like triathletes. They're more muscular than most women, and sometimes the way that they look more like men than women. Let's just put it that way. But it's still extremely beautiful, and this kind of the way that her arm disappears back into space to hold up this book, and the modeling here that makes the light seem to come from over here. It's just all fabulous. But this drawing is very interesting too. I mean, look at how carefully he studied the way the left hand would work here, and the toe. This I love this toe pushing off from this kind of box thing. It's just it's just everything. If you draw or paint, this stuff just rocks your world. You just can't believe it. It's so good. Okay, so once I was paging through the pages of the New Yorker magazine, and I saw this photograph by Annie Leibovitz of Serena Williams, who's a famous tennis player and an athlete, and I suddenly realized that uh, Annie Leibovitz saw in Serena's powerful upper back, she recognized the pose of the Libyan Sibyl from her art history knowledge. And she asked Serena to pose almost as the Libyan Sibyl, which I think is just beautiful. It's not exactly the same pose, obviously, down here, but it's pretty darn close. And you can see that because she's an athlete and she's a tennis player, her upper body is very powerful, just like the body of the Libyan Sibyl here. So this shows you, and her lower body also looks incredibly strong. This shows you the value of understanding art history, especially if you're an artist. Even if you're a photographer like Annie Leibovitz or me, understanding the history of painting and drawing and all of that can inform your work. She even knew how to light it. She had thought about the Libyan Sibyl enough to know that the light's coming from the Sibyl's left, and so she put her own studio lighting that way for Serena's portrait here. Okay, so that's all. Now, there's a lot more that we could talk about in regard to um, the High Renaissance. We could be talking about Raphael. We could be talking about also the Northern Renaissance. But again, in college, some of that is left up to you to do that kind of digging on your own. But make sure, for the purposes of being able to write a good essay on the exam, that you take notes from this lecture and take notes from the videos that I directed you to during the lecture, the ones about Leonardo, the ones about Michelangelo, and that you take notes from those Khan Academy videos so that you'll have all your notes together in one place so that you can write a good essay, and it won't be hard, and you'll know what to do on the exam, because the exam format is going to be the same as the midterm. So I'm going to go ahead and post this on Wednesday probably, and we will have a Zoom discussion on Friday. So write a question about the Renaissance, upload it to the Dropbox, and then on Friday we'll have a discussion of some of those questions in our regular Zoom meeting, which I'll send you an invitation to. Okay, that's it. Bye.